Hello and welcome to Talking Templars. I'm Tony McMahon.
And I'm Dr. Steve Tibble.
He is indeed, you know, and I am, I suppose, a TV historian. I cover mainstream history, but I also like to dabble in esoteric and conspiratorial waters, which I don't think you like to go there, do you?
No, I'm the cynical academic in this duo. So so we'll see how that goes.
So what we are going to ask today, when we're looking at the Knights Templar, is a question that certainly intrigues me. I think it intrigues you as well. Is could the Crusades have actually been won? Now, when we say could the Crusades have been won, we mean could the Crusades have been won by the Crusaders and not the other side. So just to be clear,
yeah, no, that's true.
Need to be clear about who we think should have been doing the winning there, or not. We're not saying they should have won, but we are saying could they have been won? Not making a value judgment.
No, you're digging a hole there.
Oh, I'm making a mess already.
Time to stop.
Stop. But basically, do you think, looking at, you know, especially obviously the Battle of Hattin and all those key moments, you know, did the Crusaders screw up, or were they always going to screw up?
Yeah. I mean, that is a really good question. I think we have wonderful things like Google Maps now, and we have, you know, wonderful things like the CIA website showing GDP and populations and things like that. Sadly, in the 12th century, the lads didn't have that kind of data, and I think for any thinking person in the early 12th century, if they had materials like that, would have realized it was unwinnable. I think it's pretty much like the American Civil War. You look at the size of the relative populations, you look at the size of the relative economies, and you just say, well, clearly this is going to have one outcome. And almost the worst thing that you can do is prolong the agony. So I always think with the American Civil War, the fact that Lee decided to go on the Confederate side and was such a good general, you know, he had good intentions, but all he did was effectively continue the war to the point where it destroyed his country and his part of America. And I think it's pretty much the same with the Crusades. I mean, if you look at it with Google Earth, you can see that in terms of population, you know, a lot of the population, most of the population of the Holy Land are still Christian at this point, but they're demilitarized. The guys coming over from Europe to help are, you know, a long way from home, and there's not many of them, and they're surrounded by this huge, you know, cluster of Muslim states on the fringe of a huge Muslim empire. Now, what are the odds of them winning? I have to say, not very much at all.
I mean, it is one of those things. You touch on the demographics of the region at the time, and we kind of think from our 20th, 21st century perspective that a group of Christian knights went into the Muslim Middle East. But of course, the Middle East was still very kind of much more religiously diverse then.
Yeah,
but having said that, even though there were big Christian populations in Egypt and Syria, and when I say big, we could be talking 20, 30, 40% in some of these parts of the world, nevertheless the Christians there couldn't be assumed to be allies of the Crusaders. In fact, they could actually be quite hostile. Plus, we've got the Byzantine Empire, which is a Christian empire, which covers modern-day Turkey, or most of it. So it's a very complex picture. You've got the Jewish populations as well, of course, and other religions. So they're not going into a kind of uniformly Muslim area, but that doesn't necessarily help them.
No, you're right. I mean, and the key word is militarized. So, for instance, with the Jewish population, there is a small Jewish population there, but after 1099, they're militarily negligible because they're not armed, and it's much the same is true. You know, although most of the population of the Holy Land were still Christian, they'd been demilitarized for centuries. And similarly, you know, say around Aleppo, which is a big Muslim stronghold, used to be a Christian city, but the Muslims had captured it in the 7th century. Large sections of the population were still Christian, but they were demilitarized. So from a sort of practical geostrategic point of view, they couldn't bring as much to bear as they would have wanted. Whereas in the Crusader states, like the County of Edessa or the Principality of Antioch, the reason why they fell into Crusader hands so easily was because the majority of the population were Christian. They greeted the Crusaders as liberators, and they were very happy serving in Crusader armies. So one of the big big forgotten ironies of the Crusades is that the majority of Crusader armies on the ground in the Middle East, as opposed to the military tourists from Europe, were actually Arabs or Syrians or Armenians. These were local people fighting for local Christian communities.
And I think that's an interesting point that's sometimes forgotten, because we tend to racialize the Crusades and we'd impose our kind of, and I'm talking about all sides, I think, who look at it from whatever political perspective. But as you say, there were the kind of the Turcopoles, who were the kind of auxiliaries who were from the local areas, but also among the elite Crusaders, they were intermarrying with Arab families and Armenians and so on.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very much more complex picture, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely right. I mean, if you think of, say, the Vikings, everything we know about genetics now is saying that the Vikings, qua Viking, didn't have a huge impact even in the UK where they came and settled, and it's because, the Vikings, like the Crusaders, were boats full of young men. They weren't bringing their families with them. And the first thing they do when they touch dry land is, in the case of the Crusaders, is start to marry local women. In the case of the Vikings, it's probably a bit less Jane Austen than that. But but certainly in terms of the DNA, these are not matrilineal DNA is not coming from the Crusaders or from the Vikings. And you find right from the word go, even the kings of Jerusalem, the counts of Edessa, their wives are local women. And so right from the very beginning, most of the kings of Jerusalem were of mixed race. And it was of profound unimportance. We're quite obsessed with race at the moment, but they really weren't. Often you look at a document and it's very hard to tell what race these people are. The defining thing for them, the thing they were really interested in, was religion, in a way that we're much less interested in religion. But you just have to accept that. That's the way things work.
Just a quick Templar ad break here to tell you all about Dr. Steve Tibble's book, Crusader Criminals, all about those who went a little bit rogue in the Holy Land, the interplay between criminality and crusading, some of the larger-than-life characters who did some very wicked and evil things on crusade. So get your copy at Amazon, Waterstones, and other outlets. And really, the Crusaders couldn't have held on to those territories unless they had actually kind of assimilated to a degree. There have been these kind of alliances formed.
I think the Crusaders would have lasted, kind of a long weekend. I mean, they pretty much were nearly, on the verge of being snuffed out by about 1101. When most of the Crusaders went back home in 1099, most of what were left, were defeated by the Egyptians at Ramla, one of the Ramla battles. Again in 1113, there was, the army of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem were almost wiped out. It could have happened at any time. The stabilizing effect, such as it was the fact that the population of Christians there were broadly on side. I mean, always going to be tensions. There's tensions within communities and between communities. So you can't overgeneralize, but by and large, there was a broadly kind of ecumenical demographic approach, and people did pull together.
I mean, one of the factors that people obviously comment on about in terms of the early success was the disunity on the Muslim side. Obviously, you've got the element of the Seljuk Turks who have come in, and they're not exactly, their relationship with the well-established caliphate is not exactly one of friends, and I mean, they're invaders, basically. And is that something the Crusaders were able to plug into, shall we say? Yeah,
I mean, there were multiple divisions. As you say, the Seljuks were, invaders. They also weren't theologians. You look at the early Turkic warlords that the Crusaders are coming across, and they are drinking very heavily. They're they've got their astrologers. These are not guys who are, mainstream Islamic warriors. They're they still have a lot of their religions from the steppes. They're, shamanistic religions. Equally, it's easy to forget that they did actually cooperate with the Crusaders in many instances. There are battles where you get a Crusader army on each side with their Muslim allies. Even the military orders, like the Hospitallers and the Templars, had Muslim auxiliaries, Muslim armies fighting on their side, and so on. So I think we naturally like to put things in boxes. We want everything to be black and white. I think on the ground it was much more about power politics and demographics and people doing what they needed to do.
And we do have instances. I think one of the Damascus campaigns, but we have the Crusaders. They're getting quite intimately involved in the kind of family disputes on the Muslim side, coming in on one side of the royal family against another side, and they're playing, and that's acceptable.
Absolutely, and you see even with really extreme groups like the Assassins, who we still see in Assassin's Creed resonating, down the centuries, that they sometimes fight the Crusaders, but very often they're allies of the Crusaders. They're even talking about forming active military alliances and coming together more closely in terms of religion. So you try and put a very nice, easy, convenient line in the sand, but human beings don't obey those rules.
And then we look at somebody like Saladin, who obviously was, he was admired in the West among Christians. You get the feeling some people in the West were saying, if only we had a leader like Saladin, we'd be doing a lot better. There were even stories, I believe, that some people tried to suggest that Saladin was actually a Christian, or that he'd come from a Christian family. There was that kind of level of admiration.
Yeah.
But he definitely bests the Crusaders, but he's not like Baybars later on. He's not utterly ruthless. There's something a bit more, I would say gentlemanly, but there's
yeah, I never understand. You're right. That is absolutely what people think, and I never quite get it. Saladin spent a lot of time and money on his PR, so he was surrounded by his courtiers who wrote his chronicles, and they were clearly part of a PR program. The reason he needed a PR program was because he was a usurper. He wasn't Turkic. He wasn't from the region. He was a Kurd of a semi-nomadic heritage, and he'd betrayed his boss. He was only the Sultan because he'd ousted, effectively disobeyed, and waited for his boss to die before he took over. Yeah. So his boss, Nur al-Din, was Turkic and Sunni. Saladin was a foreigner. He was a Kurd, but a different kind of foreigner to the Turks. But he had so much more to prove. He was all about trying to prove legitimacy, and so one of his main ways of fighting, proving for his legitimacy, was to say, well, it's okay for me to kill all my Muslim rivals and attack them, which is actually what he spent 90% of his time doing, because if you let me win that battle, I'll spend the other 10% of the time fighting the infidels and the assassin heretics. So he made a big play of being able to beat up the other. And actually, this whole thing about being chivalric, I never really buy into it. He executed prisoners of war habitually long before Richard the Lionheart came into the region. Templars and Hospitallers that were captured were just routinely executed as prisoners, and that was his policy. There was nothing chivalric about that. He was someone you could deal with. He wasn't quite as menacing as, say, the Mongols or Dear Baybars, but I don't think he deserves his chivalric image.
But I guess he is the guy who takes Jerusalem and ever wanted to know more about the history of the Knights Templar from their origins through to the end, and a few of the conspiracy theories in between, then buy the Knights Templar History and Mystery by Tony McMahon. It's available on Amazon, Waterstones and other outlets. Buy it to get a comprehensive look at the Knights Templar. Do you think, looking at the events around, what happens at Cresson and Tiberius and obviously Hattin, Templar Grandmaster of the time, de Ridford, it's hard to find him a sympathetic figure. You do get the feeling that the Templars are being led by a hot-headed Grandmaster at this time, Gerard de Ridford. The relationships with the Hospitallers is appalling. There is kind of fratricidal conflict within Jerusalem, with the Templars and Hospitallers on different sides in that conflict. And in a way, Saladin can't believe his luck. Do you think if the Christian side had been a bit more, had made more rational decisions, and there'd been more unity? You've got, the head of Tripoli against the Jerusalem.
It's crazy.
They're damaging each other more than.
In a sense, there's two questions there, really. One is what was Gerard of Ridford like, and was he actively unhelpful? And I think he was very unhelpful. But the other question is, would it have made a difference? Was it that caused the collapse of 1187? And I think you're quite right. It's very hard to find Gerard as a sympathetic character. There are some revisionist attempts, and because historians always love being revisionist and saying, oh, it really wasn't that bad, and you can make an argument to say, well, there was some rationality to what he was doing, and he was, blah, blah, blah. But I still don't buy it. I think he did make some very bad military decisions. At Cressons, he launched his guys into a headlong attack when they could have withdrawn. I think they still could have withdrawn.
I mean, the Grand Master of the Hospitallers is begging him not to do it.
Oh my God!
And he's basically saying, "You big blonde sissy,"
yeah.
at him, and he survives, and the poor Hospitaller Grand Master dies.
Absolutely. Yeah. The character who Gerard always reminds me of is Lord Cardigan of Charge of the Light Brigade. Somebody who's kind of pig-headed, rigid. He's personally brave. So Cardigan rode into the Charge of the Light Brigade, didn't even draw his sword, went up to the men dying all around him, charged up to the Russian artillery, kind of touched one of the guns just so he could say he'd done it, and then rode back out, leaving 2/3 of his guys behind. And that's exactly what Gerard did at Cressons. He was personally brave, but he was one of the only 4 people who rode out. And you find the same at Hattin. He was giving very bad advice to Guy de Lusignan, the king of Jerusalem, who was not a great leader, but he could have been better with good advice. And then at the Siege of Acre, you find Gerard actually fighting very well, but he's kind of like fighting in the line. He's somebody who he was over promoted. He would have made a great sort of company commander, but you put him as a general, and his emotions get the better of him.
And jumping slightly ahead, I mean, we have the entry then of the Mongols. They were the kind of the great hope for a troubled crusade. I mean, but the problem with the Mongols is, and you've said this before, is they're not anybody's fool. They're not going to be slotted into somebody else's strategy. Their strategy is paramount. So do you think the kind of hopes of a Crusader-Mongol alliance were always bound for failure?
I think they were bound to fail in a strategic sense. You could argue that in the short term they could have been, on the battlefield you could make some kind of an arrangement could have been made. In terms of a formal alliance, you just come back to this thing where can we be friends with the Mongols? Well, the Mongols don't have friends. They have people who submit to them. They have people who they control. And if you're not prepared to put yourself in that position, then you're just kidding yourself. As we see with so many of our modern politicians, you can cozy up to the Mongols, but you can't really get into bed with them in the way that you might want to. And just to come back to that earlier point, Tony, as well, about whether Hattin was an inevitable train crash. So you've got Gerard, and it's creating this train crash. I think the amazing thing is that Hattin didn't happen before. The extraordinary thing is that the Crusaders had managed to defer it as long as they did, because it was, I always think it's like a game, where you need to roll 1 to 5 to survive, and the Crusaders need to keep rolling that 1 to 5. On the Muslim side, they can roll a 6 and they'll be destroyed. But there's another Muslim army coming along next year or the year after and the year after that. Whereas the Crusaders, when it came to Hattin, they finally rolled the 6. And I think it's extraordinary that it didn't happen in 1113 or, at any number of times in between.
And then the Crusaders kind of retreat, obviously, from Jerusalem to Acre, and Acre becomes a kind of entrepot, very sort of commercially successful, a bit sleazy.
Don't knock it.
But it actually kind of reminds me, and I hope nobody is offended if they come from this place. It kind of reminds me of the way the Chinese tolerated Hong Kong and even Macau for a long time. It's kind of trading hubs that they kind of allowed the British to continue and the Portuguese to continue running for a while until it no longer suited their purposes. And I wonder if there was a kind of, that's the way they kind of viewed Acre. They tolerated it because it was a kind of vice-ridden but very commercially successful place. But eventually you get somebody like Baybars, the Mamluk leader, who turns up and says, right, I'm calling time on this. So he
starts to roll up the Crusader kingdom. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think that's a very good comparison, actually, because one of the things that kept the Crusaders going in the 13th century was the fact that their ports were at the end of one of the Silk Road lanes. So that was all fine. Everybody wins. And that's one of the weird things about warfare in the Crusades, is that it can be incredibly bloodthirsty and merciless. And then effectively people all stop for tea because there's a caravan of merchants coming through. And literally, I mean, we've got a Muslim account from the 1180s, Ibn Jubayr, who just comments on the fact he's a traveller and he's with other travellers, and they are happy to go through from Muslim territory to the coast with valuable goods, and the Muslim side get their taxes, the Christian side get their taxes, everybody wins. And they're in the middle of effectively a world war, and it all stops when they get there because money talks. And I think arguably the Crusades could have finished much sooner if that hadn't been the case. They were there almost because of the whim of the people around them and the convenience. There is quite a lot of evidence that the trade routes actually shifted towards the end of the period and moved slightly north, which again would explain why Bibal's successors were happy to kind of close down the Frankish entrepôts there, because they weren't producing the same money.
And also, of course, Europe loses interest. I mean, there's things going on in Europe and dynamics in play. And, as you've said before, the last Templar Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, just doesn't seem to understand that times are changing and that the failure of the Crusades means it's the end. It's curtains for the Crusades. But people don't necessarily think the Crusades are over when we think they're over. I mean, there's a great lag, isn't there? And even in the 1500s,
you're a great lag. Yes.
Yeah. No. Well, that's all I can say. But
it's been said before, I know.
But people are still thinking in the 1500s. You get the Portuguese, dreaming of Crusades to Mecca or something. Was there a sense, do you think, with the loss of Acre that that's it? Or did people think it's a lull, it'll carry on? But what?
No, you're right. I mean, I think it's humans are emotional creatures as well as logical ones. And I think the rational thinking person would have said, good game. It's over now. Let's hang our lances up. And particularly people who are rational and have to fund it, definitely started to think more that way. But given that people were so much more pious than we can ever really imagine, the spirit of the Crusades continued, and it carried on far longer than you'd think. For instance, even when the Templars were being suppressed, the Pope was in the middle of raising more funds for another campaign, and the Templars were co-leading it with the Hospitallers and the Italians, and King Philip of France had ostensibly said he was going to take part as well, as had most of the rest of Europe. I mean, it was increasingly unrealistic to think that we could have, to recover that whole part of the Middle East. But people were still prepared to give it a try.
So Philip hoping to emulate his saintly grandfather, but at the same time destroying the Templars who'd fought side by side with his saintly
But again, it's that same tension, isn't it? You can, emotionally, he still might have wanted to be devout. He was certainly very superstitious, potentially gullible, but that doesn't stop him being greedy as well. So, all that wonderful melange of things that us humans have.
Piety and money, never a good. Well, we're going to call time there for now, but we will, of course, return to this topic and drill down into certain elements of it, which are very fascinating. But that's a kind of an overview of the question of whether or not the Crusades could have been won. So I think we're both agreed no.
I think so.
I think no. But
an amazingly good innings, from a Crusader perspective. Yeah. Largely because people couldn't be bothered to get rid of them towards the end.
And that was 250 years of bizarre tolerance. But for now, it's goodbye from myself, Tony McMahon.
And goodbye from me, Dr. Steve Tibble.
And until we meet again, non nobis domine.